They laughed when she stumbled entering the boardroom, her coffee spilling across marble floors, staining her only professional outfit. But what they did not know was that this woman who they mocked and dismissed would become the architect of their downfall. Not through revenge, but through a power so profound it would rewrite every rule they thought protected them. And in exactly 365 days, she would stand in that same room, holding documents that proved she had been 10 steps ahead all along. Sarah Mitchell, 28 years old, stood in the bathroom of Wagner Industries, wiping coffee stains from her blouse with cheap paper towels that disintegrated in her trembling hands, and she could still hear their laughter echoing from the conference room where 5 men in tailored suits had watched her humiliation with barely concealed amusement. And the worst part was not the spilled coffee or the ruined blouse, but the look in their eyes that said she did not belong, that she never would belong in their world of power and money and influence built over generations, while she was just a girl from nowhere, with a state school degree, and dreams too big for someone like her. And Marcus Chen, the chief financial officer, had actually said out loud, "Well, that was quite an entrance," as the others chuckled, and she had wanted to disappear to run from that building and never return. But instead she had picked up her scattered papers with shaking hands and taken her seat at the far end of the table where junior analysts were permitted to observe, but never speak. And for the next 2 hours, she had sat there burning with shame while they discussed quarterly projections and market strategies. And she had made a decision in that moment that would change everything. She would not quit. She would not run. She would learn their game, and she would beat them at it, but not in the way they expected, not by becoming like them, but by becoming something they could never comprehend or defend against. The first 3 months were brutal, because Sarah realized that her humiliation had been intentional, that Marcus Chen had deliberately scheduled the meeting 30 minutes early, knowing she would rush, knowing she would be flustered. And when she discovered this through an accidentally forwarded email chain where they joked about setting up the new girl, she understood that this was not about competence or credentials, but about power and control and keeping certain people in their assigned place. And she also understood that complaining would accomplish nothing, because the head of human resources reported directly to Marcus, and the chief executive officer, Michael Wagner, was Marcus's former roommate from Yale, and they had built this company together over 15 years, creating a culture where loyalty to the inner circle mattered more than ethics or excellence, and women like Sarah were hired only to satisfy diversity requirements and kept carefully away from any real authority or information. And this realization could have destroyed her, could have confirmed every doubt she had ever carried about whether she deserved to be there. But instead, it crystallized into something hard and clear, like diamond forming under impossible pressure. She started staying late, not obviously late, but just 30 minutes after everyone else had gone when the office was quiet and the cleaning crew moved through empty cubicles, and she began noticing things like how Marcus always printed certain documents instead of keeping them digital, and how he used a personal shredder in his office rather than the company service, and how twice a week he met with Edmund Price, the head of acquisitions, in the parking garage instead of the office. And Sarah was not naturally suspicious, but she had grown up poor, really poor. The kind of poor where you learn to notice everything because missing small details can mean going hungry or worse. And she recognized the behavior patterns of people who had something to hide because she had seen them her whole life in landlords who demanded cash only, and employers who paid under the table, and neighbors who looked over their shoulders before speaking. So she began documenting everything, not because she had a plan, but because her instincts told her to pay attention. And she kept detailed notes in a personal encrypted cloud drive that had nothing to do with the company systems, and she wrote down dates and times and the names of people who met privately, and she began teaching herself forensic accounting using free online courses late at night in her studio apartment, because something about the numbers in the quarterly reports did not add up, and she had always been good with numbers. Had paid her way through college, doing tax preparation for immigrant families in her neighborhood who trusted her because she was one of them, someone who understood what it meant to be invisible. Month 4 brought a new humiliation when she was assigned to work directly under Marcus on a merger analysis, and he made her redo her work 7 times, finding fault with formatting and font choices, while ignoring the substance of her analysis, which accurately predicted that the target company was overvalued by at least 40%, and when the merger went through anyway. Despite her warnings, and the company's stock price dropped exactly as she had forecasted, Marcus blamed the failed integration on her preliminary research, and she received a formal reprimand in her personnel file. And once again, she was called into a meeting room where men in expensive suits explained to her very slowly and carefully that perhaps she was not cut out for this level of analysis, and maybe she should consider a transition to administrative support, where her skills might be better utilized. And she sat there taking notes on their suggestions with a calm expression, while inside she was screaming, but she did not scream, and she did not cry, and she did not quit, because she had discovered something interesting in those merger documents. The target company had been owned by a shell corporation registered in Delaware, and that shell corporation was owned by another entity in the Cayman Islands. And when Sarah traced the ownership structure using public records and business registration databases that anyone could access, but almost nobody bothered to check, she found that the ultimate beneficial owner was a trust controlled by Edmund Price's wife. And suddenly the overpriced merger made perfect sense, because it was not a business decision, but a transfer of wealth from Wagner Industries shareholders to Edmund Price's family, and Marcus Chen had been the one to structure the deal and push it through over the objections of the due diligence team, and Michael Wagner had signed off on everything, despite clear warnings in the documentation, and this was not incompetence, this was fraud. Sarah spent the next 6 months building an airtight case, working entirely on her own time, using only publicly available information and the notes she had accumulated, because she knew that accessing company systems for personal investigation would be illegal and would discredit anything she found, and she studied securities law and corporate governance, and she read every filing Wagner Industries had made with the SEC for the past decade, and she found patterns of self-dealing and conflicts of interest that went back years, always carefully structured to stay just barely within legal boundaries, or at least to maintain plausible deniability. And she discovered that Marcus Chen was a genius at creating corporate structures that hid the truth in plain sight, using complicated webs of subsidiaries and partnerships that were technically disclosed but practically incomprehensible to anyone without specialized knowledge. Month 9 brought another test, when Alicia Rowan, the only female vice president at Wagner Industries, was fired suddenly and publicly. And the official reason was performance issues. But Sarah had worked with Alicia on 2 projects and knew she was brilliant and thorough. And when Sarah saw Alicia leaving the building with a box of personal items looking shell-shocked, she followed her to the parking garage and asked what really happened. And Alicia had stared at her for a long moment before saying, "You are the junior analyst who spilled coffee." And Sarah had nodded, and Alicia had said, "I found irregularities in the European subsidiary accounts, and when I reported them to Marcus, he told me to drop it. And when I did not drop it, I was terminated, and before I left, I was required to sign an NDA with a clause saying I would forfeit my entire severance package if I ever spoke about company business to anyone, including regulators." And Sarah understood in that moment that she was not the only person who had noticed the corruption, but she might be the only person willing to risk everything to expose it. She spent 3 weeks confirming Alicia's findings using publicly available financial statements from the European subsidiaries, which were required to file reports in their local jurisdictions, and the irregularities were there once you knew what to look for. Millions of euros in consulting fees paid to companies that had no employees and no office space, just registered addresses in Luxembourg and Cyprus, and when Sarah traced those companies back, she found they were owned by family members of Wagner Industries executives. And this was the same pattern repeated internationally, looting the company systematically, while shareholders and employees believed the business was simply underperforming in challenging markets. Month 11. Sarah requested a meeting with the Internal Audit Committee, and she had to request it 3 times before they agreed to see her. And when she finally sat across from 3 board members who clearly resented the interruption to their schedules, she presented a 20-page summary of her findings, complete with citations to specific documents and financial statements. And she watched their expressions change from irritation to attention to alarm, and then to something else, something that looked like calculation, and the chairman of the audit committee. Warren Prescott thanked her for her diligence and promised a thorough investigation, and asked her not to discuss this matter with anyone while they looked into it. And Sarah had smiled and agreed, and walked out of that conference room knowing exactly what would happen next. They fired her 4 days later for violating company policy regarding unauthorized investigation and access to confidential information, even though she had used only public records, and they threatened her with legal action if she made defamatory statements about Wagner Industries or its executives, and they offered her 6-month severance if she signed an NDA identical to the one they had forced on Alicia Rowan. And Marcus Chen himself delivered this news with an expression of fake sympathy, saying that she clearly had potential but had shown poor judgment, and perhaps someday she would understand that loyalty was more important than being right. And Sarah had looked at him and said, "I will not sign." And Marcus had smiled a cold smile and said, "Then you get nothing." And Sarah had walked out of Wagner Industries for the last time with her coffee-stained blouse in a cardboard box, and exactly 0 regrets. Because what Marcus Chen did not know, what none of them knew, was that Sarah had already filed a detailed complaint with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and that she had included copies of every document, every analysis, every piece of evidence she had compiled over 11 months, and she had also sent copies to 3 investigative journalists who specialized in corporate fraud, and she had posted a summary of her findings on a forum read by short sellers and activist investors who made their money exposing exactly this kind of corruption. And then she had waited. Month 12. The SEC announced an investigation into Wagner Industries for potential securities fraud and self-dealing, and the stock price dropped 30% in a single day, and Michael Wagner went on CNBC to call the allegations baseless and to blame short sellers for spreading misinformation. But the journalists had published their articles complete with documentation, and suddenly everyone was asking questions, and the board of directors announced that Warren Prescott had resigned from the audit committee and that they were bringing in external investigators, and Marcus Chen hired a criminal defense attorney. Month 13, Sarah received a call from the SEC asking her to testify, and she spent 3 days in a conference room explaining her findings to investigators and attorneys who took notes and asked detailed questions and seemed genuinely angry about what had been done. And she also received a call from a law firm representing shareholders who were filing a class action lawsuit, and they wanted her as an expert witness. And she agreed, and she began to understand that her humiliation in that boardroom had been the beginning of something much larger than revenge. It had been the beginning of accountability. Month 14. Marcus Chen was arrested for securities fraud and conspiracy, and Edmund Price was charged as a co-conspirator, and Michael Wagner resigned as CEO, claiming he had been deceived by his subordinates, though the evidence suggested he had known everything, and Warren Prescott was under investigation for obstruction of justice for his handling of Sarah's initial complaint. And Wagner Industries agreed to a settlement with the SEC that included $80 million in fines and disgorgement of ill-gotten gains and fundamental restructuring of their board and governance practices. Month 15. Sarah was hired by the SEC as a forensic investigator at twice her former salary, and she received the Whistleblower Award from the SEC, which amounted to over $2 million based on the fines collected, and she used half of that money to establish a foundation, providing legal support and protection for corporate whistleblowers, especially women and people of color who faced retaliation for reporting misconduct, and she called it the Alicia Rowan Foundation Month 16. She walked into her first day at the SEC, and during orientation, she met another new investigator named Jennifer Kim, who had exposed procurement fraud at a defense contractor and lost her career and her reputation before being vindicated. And they looked at each other and understood without speaking that they were part of something important, a generation of women who refused to be silenced, who chose truth over belonging, who transformed their humiliation into power, not by becoming cruel or corrupt themselves, but by insisting that the system follow its own rules. And sometimes late at night, Sarah thought about that boardroom and the sound of their laughter and Marcus Chen saying, well, that was quite an entrance. And she thought about how right he had been, because her entrance had changed everything, not just for her, but for every person who came after, who would inherit a slightly more accountable, slightly more just version of corporate America, because one woman with coffee stains on her blouse had decided that being laughed at was not the worst thing that could happen to her, but that staying silent would be, and that the hidden power they never saw was not cunning or ruthlessness, but simply the willingness to tell the truth, regardless of cost, and to build something better from the ruins of their corruption. And she understood finally that real power was never about dominating others, but about having the courage to stand alone when standing alone was the only honest choice, and to trust that eventually the truth would find allies and that justice delayed was not always justice denied. Sometimes it was justice being built carefully, brick by ordinary people who refused to accept that humiliation was their destiny.